Alright, next up we are going to add some puddles and some wet areas to the ground where all of these waterfalls are landing. Or at least in general areas where it would be believable for them to be wet, but areas where it would look good artistically. So here I've got my wet surface render from Clarice from earlier. This is the render where we took all of the upwards looking faces and applied the water material, and all of the sideways looking faces and just applied the standard material. So let's grab this by clicking select all and copy, and let's go back in to our project here, and let's paste this here in the water group. So let's take the previous work we had done on the water and let's just group this within the group, and we'll just call this, I guess, canals. Okay, and let's take our new layer and let's just go up to our ID passes, and let's just select our ID with the normals, and let's go into the channels, and let's just control click on the green thumbnail to select all of the Y faces. And let's go back. And having scrolled down to our wet surface layer, let's just add this as a mask. And actually our render is a little bit dark, so let's create a curves and apply that here and make it much brighter. Alright. And we're gonna group this and we'll call this puddles. So let's zoom in a little bit. Let's right click and go into our blending options. And here in the underlying layer blend if, let's adjust the value. Remember, this allows us to be able to see through this layer into the ones behind it based on how bright they are. So you can either key out the highlights or the shadows. So let's change these values to something like this maybe. Okay. So now you can see, compared to the previous render, in our new one, we are getting a lot of see-through areas. So I want the puddles to slightly interact with the ground underneath them, which is why it makes sense for me to have them be slightly see-through. Okay. So let's go and select our puddles group, and let's just make a mask and click Ctrl+I to invert it. And let's paint in some puddles. We'll just use a hard round brush, and we can paint in a little bit. And the great thing about using an actual render for this is because these values on the water are consistent with how the lighting works in our scene and the HDRI that we are using. Okay, so some there maybe. Maybe not there. Not much point adding here, it's quite invisible. Let's have a look. Okay. Maybe there. Let's add some here. It kind of interacts with the grass quite nicely. Maybe lower opacity. So it looks like this huge waterfall has spilled a lot of water here. Paint some in here. Okay. Well, let's see if we can just use a soft round brush a little bit. Yeah, kind of. We could make this whole area slightly wet because I'm kind of setting the scene to seem like it has recently rained. So it has stopped raining, but all of the water is still flowing off of the taller structures in this scene. So maybe it's just dripping on here. Okay, we could actually select our puddles group and duplicate it. We'll just call this... I'll just call it puddles too. And we could maybe adjust this slightly to cut out some more of the shadows from underneath. So let's zoom out a bit. And let's clear this group, or clear this mask rather. And let's just select a background. And let's just paint in a little bit here. So all of these surfaces will seem to be slightly wet. Oh, here it gets a nice response, especially. Maybe let's check here. Okay. And we could also create a new curves on top of our render, wet surface render, and make things even brighter. And this has gone a little bit blue, so we could set it to luminosity to make it slightly less saturated. And let's invert it. And let's just paint a little bit here this way. Just a bit of extra light on these reflections. Alright. So it's a subtle effect, but a little bit of wet surfaces, I think it helps. Let's move on to overpainting some of these straight CG edges. I think the water now looks pretty good. So the next step in making your image look less computer generated is to try to eliminate all of these very straight edges. These are the kind of edges that you do not get in real life, or edges of this sharpness. We want to slightly overpaint all of them, or at least the ones that are very noticeable, like for example here, and try and get a little bit more of a natural look that way. So let's go to the top of our layer stack here, above the birds. Let's create a new layer, and we are going to call this Edges. And the reason we want to be working above the haze and the rolling fog and the depth is because whatever changes we make underneath it will be overridden by those layers. So for example, if I grab my clone stamp tool here and select a square brush maybe, and then just clone a little bit from here, and I paint a little bit of something on. Here it works, but if we have this layer underneath, what happens is that our fog layers override it and we do not see the effect. So we want to keep this on top, and that's why this is one of the last steps in the painting process, because it's just finalizing these little details to make a really nice, sophisticated piece of artwork. So let's just maybe zoom in even more, and let's just clone stamp from our below layers, make sure that it's set to current and below here, and let's paint a little bit of irregularity. Doesn't have to be too much. You can, for example, pretend that there are more pieces of geometry jutting out and kind of try to think of like where they would be and whatnot. Just a little bit of something to kind of break up the edge, and no one is going to notice this detail too much, but it will add to the overall look. And it's all very easy. You just keep picking spots near where you are painting. Just a little bit there. Let's go over that whole area. You know, adding some nonsense detail kind of helps. Let's do that. That building is a little bit further away, so I've reduced the size of my brush as the details would be proportionately reduced due to the distance. A little bit here. Can't even paint a little bit in from the other side, maybe. Actually, let's not do that. Let's just paint from the inside. Okay, let's do some more maybe here. Here, these poor houses, we can make the rooftops look kind of like they are planks of wood jutting out, maybe. Just anything to make these shapes slightly more detailed. Because we have a lot of detail through the textures that we have applied, but they don't displace the edges, so the edges still look very simplistic. Let's make some changes here. And I try to do this step right at the end when I'm sure that everything else is looking good, because if you change anything underneath, then these edges will need to be changed as well. And it's a big commitment. So you try to waste as little time as possible. So doing these at the end is the best idea, I think. Okay. Let's scroll down. Nearly done with this area. Okay. Let's zoom out a little bit. Actually, let's look at what we have so far. If I fit screen. Sorry, my laptop is being a little bit slow handling this. Okay, so if we enable and disable this, there is a subtle difference, but it adds a lot more character to the buildings and makes them look a lot more natural. Okay, so I think we can do some more work, not necessarily on the edges, but just final fixes. For example, here, I don't like this floating bit. I think we could do something to connect it with the building above it. So maybe let's just clone stamp from here. And let's just paint in some connection pillars here. Alright, something like that. No one's gonna notice this except for you, so don't worry too much about it. Alright. I think furthermore we could make this whole top area look a lot nicer. First let's plug this gap. And then maybe let's paint something more interesting here a little bit. Just nonsense detail, but just wanting to break up those areas a little bit. Alright. Maybe something here. And I'm just copying from the image itself. I'm not doing anything new, so it's quite quick and simple. So here the edges are also a little bit CG looking. Let's change them. Alright. Here as well we could for example, offset this edge a little bit. Here I think we could paint in a little bit more something. Alright. On this side we could, let's zoom in. Yeah, there's a lot to fix. For example, this edge is very straight. And this process doesn't take very long. But you go through a lot of the parts of the image just trying to make things look slightly less 3D. This is very straight. Alright. Then let's have a look at this area. I think here the edge of this arch is again too clean. We could break it up a little bit with the detail from the inside. Just a little bit. Here as well, for example. This edge. Just making all of the modeling look slightly more complicated in the areas where we want that detail. So we didn't have time, or we didn't have to waste time modeling all of these extremely detailed assets. Instead, we're just cheating at this stage because it's just a quick concept art. Here. Here's a very straight edge. Alright. Let's go through this a little bit. We could break this up as well. Doesn't have to be much, but just making it slightly less straight helps a lot. And let's paint in some underside here. Here maybe. Okay, I think this will do just for the demonstration purposes. We don't need to do too much, but I think you get the general idea. If I show this with fill screen, it's a very tiny change, but goes a long way in making your artwork look better. So I find that usually the last 10%, the finishing touches of the artwork, actually takes as much as half the time of my work on an artwork. So you really gotta put all of the time into making sure all of these tiny details are correct in order to push your artwork to the next level if you really want it to be a nice, complete, sophisticated piece of work. Alright, so in the next video, we are going to have a quick look at making some spaceships in Clarice. That's the only part of the image that I have not included yet, and yeah, let's go have some fun.